Want to come to an xAPI party? Honestly, it will be such fun. It really will. Welcome to The Learning Hack, a podcast about the people and technologies that are creating the future of learning. I'm John Helmer.
Now, guess what? Learning is cool. Learning is cool. Learning is cool.
People who are good at data aren't always that good at people. We shouldn't reinforce stereotypes, but you know what I mean. So I was doubly delighted to find you a guest who could not only talk interestingly and knowledgeably about using data for learning, but who was also an articulate, vibey, very human person. Pretty much your ideal learning hack guest. Kate Fitzgerald, Head of Fact. Tell us about her.
Hack Facts.
Megan Torrance is Chief Energy Officer of Torrance Learning, a custom development company based in Chelsea. No, not that Chelsea, the one in Michigan, USA. She has an MBA from Cornell and over 2 decades of experience in learning technologies. Megan is also an author and conference speaker, gardens, hikes and plays ice hockey in her spare time and organises the xAPI party. That sounds like fun.
The xAPI party?
No, the gardening.
So what did we talk about? Welcome back, Jay Curtis, Head of Themes. How was your holiday?
It was very windy, thanks, John. You and Megan talked about how L&D can be more comfortable with data, a lot about xAPI, how content developers can apply learning science to their work, and the challenges faced by women in learning.
I really enjoyed this chat with Megan. I think what's so impressive about her is that she's able to talk with equal knowledge and authority about the business, the technology, and instructional theory. There are not all that many people around who hit all those 3 bases. Give it a listen. So welcome to the podcast, Megan Torrance. I'm a sucker for a non-standard job title, and I see yours is Chief Energy Officer. So how does that reflect the way you lead your company, Torrance Learning?
Well, I think that in any organization, right, the top executives or the executive team really do set that tone. And so this is just an acknowledgement of that. I think as a leader, you set the vibe. The energy you bring into the room is the energy you get reflected back to you. And so that's important. And honestly, that's the same as when I'm leading a classroom, right? And the energy you bring to that is the kind of energy that happens in the room. So that's important, and it's a good reminder to me that we have choices about that. At the same time, we were also debating another job title for me, which was Chief Bottleneck. And so Chief Energy Officer just seemed like a lot more positive and uplifting than Chief Bottleneck, which is absolutely true some days. So.
Yes, I like Chief Bottleneck there. There is something very true about that, even though, as you say, it's kind of less uplifting. Could you just talk briefly about how you set up Torrance Learning and what your background was that led you into learning technologies?
Sure thing. My education is in communication and business, specifically the organizational side of business. And I was very fortunate, actually, early on, while I was still in school, to have some fantastic internships and jobs doing the work that sets you on a path for instructional design. So I worked in a human resources department doing training, distributed training for other units across the state on the Americans with Disabilities Act back in the late 80s and early 90s. So I had some really interesting early formative experiences. I then went to work for the organizations that's now Accenture. It was then Anderson Consulting back then. Yep. In their people practice. And so what they taught their young change management consultants to do was build training. We learned how to use authorware. We learned how to make facilitator guides and how to do instructional design. I actually then didn't do any of that work, or very little of that work, at Accenture or Arthur Andersen, which is where I went after that. I instead ran projects that built large-scale shared service accounting centers. So we were making technology and process and teams and change that helped to standardize and centralize and automate a lot of work that was otherwise being done on, Excel spreadsheets that were emailed and fax forms that were sent around from office to office. My last one of those projects was to implement United Health Group's first learning management system in 2002. It was a software company's first learning management system. And if you think about how long SCORM has been around, it was pretty early in the game, right? And so, right, and in fact, AICC was really the lead at that point, right? And SCORM was still emerging. And that really brought me back to L&D. And how I got into this. So I come at L&D both from the instructional design and the organization perspective and the platform and the systems perspective.
Yep, and with kind of the LMS as in a way, a kind of ERP system. So within that context, which I think is a really interesting background. I've seen a couple of really interesting talks you've given about data and learning. In a talk you gave in London, you made two really thought-provoking comparisons, I thought. One of them was this: most of the functions in your organizations have better data than you do. You talked about how salespeople have got data coming out of their ears and very data-driven, usually by a number. And also this one: in your Fitbits, you have better information about your health and well-being than the LMS has about learning. So I thought those were both very interesting. So how, in your view, can we normalize the use of data and familiarity with data within L&D departments best?
John, that's a great question. I think that, so I'll go back to SCORM, right? SCORM has been amazing for our industry. Our industry wouldn't be like this, right? We are both fragmented and consolidatable. We have very few barriers to entry. With a $1,500 worth of software and a laptop, you can build e-learning that works in the LMSs of the Fortune 100. Right? It's SCORM is pretty powerful stuff, but it's really limited. And because, right, in order to be standard, it needed to be limited at the time, right? So we're not used to dealing with a lot of data in L&D, most of us. Most of us fell into L&D, or a lot of us fell into L&D because we were really great at not only doing our jobs, but showing our peers how to do it. And somebody said, you should be a trainer, right? and that's how you get it, right? Cami Bean wrote a whole book on, right? The Accidental Trainer. So once you found yourself in this space, right, I think there's a couple of things that learning professionals can do to start getting more comfortable with data, because we're not used to dealing with it, right? Use the tools yourself, right? Really think about, when you're using your Fitbit, when you're using your phone, really think about the data and what might be going on behind the scenes. I think that a few years ago, I said, you know what? I'm going to tinker around, but I'm not a software developer. I'm not a hardware user. Right? So I got if this, then that. And the next thing you know, I'm using data. It is basically a system integrator. I am using data, right, to pass and to make my life better, right, as I'm passing things around, right? I also think people can hang out with the other functions in their organizations. Right? Go hang out with the marketing people. I for a couple of months or a semester or two, as an undergraduate, was an advertising major. And back then, in the 80s, advertising and marketing were kind of dark arts. You didn't ask questions, right? We didn't know. Now they're incredibly data-driven. We can learn a lot. I'm not saying L&D ought to do marketing, right? Or be like marketing, but there's a lot of similarities and we can learn from them. But logistics, research, production, finance, they all have a lot of data. And I think it's great not only to learn from them and what's possible, but in the process, you're building relationships with other parts of the organization that you may need when you are on your data-driven learning journey later on. So that's really helpful. And then, it's really, I don't know, if all of that seems beyond you and an executive walks in your door or somebody sends you an email in the next hour and says, hey, can you build me a course? Right? Your number one question should be, or can be, I don't want to say should, but can be, right? How do you measure the business outcomes related to this course? And then you're just starting to look at measurement in a way that's outside of the how many people completed it and how long did it take them.
Mm-hmm. And of course, a number of things have changed over the last few years. Not only that we've all become much more used to the idea of data in our lives, both good and ill, but also it's much easier to analyze qualitative data now. You have sentiment analysis tools and so on. And there are sort of WYSIWYG tools like the one you mentioned there, if this, then that, or if that, then this. I never remember the name of that one. But where you can kind of do bits of program without having to ever touch the code and kind of link systems together. So I suppose that will make it easier. I'd like to talk a little bit more specifically about xAPI, which is one of the things that can make it easier, but also one of the things that can make it more complex. Because I know it's an enthusiasm of yours, launched in 2012, I think I'm right. xAPI is it's showing strong growth now. 2020 saw a 20% year-on-year rise in xAPI statements generated. This is data from xapi.com. But SCORM and AICC, those standards, still between them account for 98% of course packages imported, which would seem to indicate that xAPI has still got a way to go. What can you say from your experience working with clients about the current state of awareness and adoption of xAPI?
I think this is one that's moving slower than any of us wanted it to move. Certainly slower than I wanted it to move. But I am seeing a lot of interest. So I will echo with different stats what xAPI.com found, right? In 2019, I did research with the Learning Guild on the state of xAPI adoption. Very few people in that survey we found were using it at scale. And that was, honestly, after all these years, John, it was super depressing. But I put it on a graph, and the graph looked like a traditional technology adoption graph from business school 30 years ago, right? And what it showed, right, there's 45% of the people who in 2019 said they planned on implementing xAPI in the next 1 to 3 years.
Yeah.
And then another wave of people who didn't even know yet what it was, but responded to a survey about the adoption of xAPI. So of course, after that, right, that was super excited. 45% of the market is feeling like they want to jump in. And then the pandemic hit. Right. Yeah. So then I happened to also do research with the Learning Guild. And what we found was that during the pandemic, organizations didn't do a lot that was new. There were some who leapfrogged because they had to. Yeah. But most of in my research, I really wanted to find something different. I found that organizations caught up, which was awesome. But their plans to do new things, everything from virtual reality to analytics to xAPI, the plans to adopt new things had slowed down.
Okay.
So, but I was at DevLearn last week, 2 weeks ago, some time ago, the end of October. And more companies, not vendors, actual companies, were coming to me and talking to me about helping them actually implement it. They were moving past the tinkering, experimenting stage, and they wanted to implement. And we were having solid conversations about what that we kind of laid out a 4-part roadmap over and over again, and that really resonated with people.
Right. Okay. So you were saying earlier about the adoption curve, and you were saying it fell into a standard bell curve. Yeah. So does that mean?
No, I wouldn't say a standard bell curve. I'm saying, but it looked like a wave that was coming. Right. An adoption curve that was coming. So, and there were, so standard bell curve, and I, having just spent a lot of time working with statistics recently, it's not symmetrical. Yeah. Right. Like a standard bell curve is. And there are some organizations who said, yes, we have decided we aren't using xAPI. Like, okay.
Right. Okay. So what I was trying to get at there is, are we kind of past the innovator stage into the early adopter or early majority? You know what I'm talking there with the kind of IT adoption curve.
Yep. And John, it's interesting. I see we're definitely past that early experiments, right? Early adoption, I think, is here, and I'm seeing it in both very large organizations and medium-sized organizations. But I'm seeing it happening in large organizations with a lot of clout, and they're the kinds of organizations that when that everybody's going to say, oh, they did it, we can do it too.
So what examples can you give us perhaps of really excellent use in the wild that you've seen?
Yeah, there's a few, and I would encourage your listeners, John, to check out, like, both Watershed and Veracity have great case studies. xAPI.com has some case studies, and yet Analytics is too, right? There's lots of studies out there and learning tools where.
Glad you mentioned the sponsor there. Yeah.
Okay, yeah, exactly. All right. But a lot of people are going to say, oh, those case studies are being shared by the vendors. Well, you know what? Yes, they are, because the people who work at those companies are off busy working at those companies doing their jobs, right?
Yeah.
But yeah, I mean, I went to a higher ed conference in 2018, and there was a guy there at a university in California who was using xAPI. He built all the custom JavaScript himself. And that's not his thing, right? He figured out how to do it. He used xAPI, and what he did was he was looking at how physician assistant students achieved critical decision-making skills along several different disease states. And he was able to use xAPI as his data, like that's the language his data was in. He got results out of e-learning at enough depth to be able to say that he could run cluster analysis. Say, well, it looks like 80% of the people are passing. What we have is two groups who are behaving very differently, right? Which means you're slowing down one group. Well, you're thinking, hey, 80%'s passing, right? You've got one group who are being slowed down by having to do this and could probably be off doing something that's more in depth. And you have a group who's struggling even with this material, right? Super powerful stuff. We're working with a client right now building a Slack app that uses xAPI to track interactions both one-on-one and in a group, and to be able to explore whether or not a particular style of pre-work and post-work activity is more effective than having the instructor follow up with you and have you do it, right? So obviously the instructor is very time consuming, but if the instructor is really effective, then that's time well spent. So that's super interesting. And another one I saw at DevLearn had to do with being able to use xAPI to get better question analysis out of a core. So SCORM doesn't track whether or not people are taking questions repetitively, right? How many attempts does it take you to answer this question? So if everybody passes the course, because you have to pass the course to make it stop emailing you, right? How do we know where people are actually struggling? So there's lots. I mean, we can dive in here. There's a guy at Caterpillar who's using xAPI to not only inform future training needs, right? Like what are people searching for, but also planning to feed that into an AI engine and start using that at scale to be able to provide some much more deep insights about when people's skills are getting rusty. So
those are really interesting and even inspiring stories, I think, because straight away looking at that, you can see the utility there for increasing the effectiveness of learning, productivity, which everybody's after doing at the moment. So, I mean, that is great stuff.
The way we work has changed, and the way we learn is changing too. But 70% of organisations don't feel that their learning systems can really cope with all this change. It seems there is a disconnect between what learners need right now and what most learning suites provide. In a new white paper, Ben Betts and I tell the story of how this disconnect happened and lay out a vision for what a modern learning system ought to be and do. It's called Sweet Dreams, and you can read it now.
Episode sponsor Cornerstone, a leader in adaptive HR software solutions, invites you to attend Cornerstone Convergence on November 16th and 17th, with an incredible lineup of speakers focused on helping talent and learning leaders like you to gain the tools to create a better experience for your people. You won't want to miss this all-virtual, all-free event. Register today at cornerstoneconvergence.com. I'd like to change gears slightly now and talk a bit more about kind of experience design, which I'm also involved with. The CEO of a company that does custom learning experience design, in light of what learning science tells us. And I was thinking of this when you were talking about the kind of repetition of questions stuff, because that's very learning science. What learning science tells us is that real learning starts after the event or the learning module is over, when you start to do that practice and kind of active recall. How do you avoid getting locked into that box where learning is seen as an event, sheet dip, one and done, rather than as a process where you can employ things like spaced practice in your work with clients?
That's, John, this is the quintessential question for our industry, isn't it? We get asked, hey, John, would you make me a 30-minute e-learning course, right? Or, hey, can you make me a 4-day workshop that will, solve all my problems? And those are, in one respect, they're easy. Yes, I can make you a 30-minute e-learning course. I can make you a 4-day workshop. I have really whiz-bang tools that make me look like a rock star when I do that, right?
Yeah.
And it's hard to say to that requester whom I'm trying to impress, do you realize that that's not actually going to solve your problem? Do you realize that that's not how people learn effectively and stick? And there is a space where those things are necessary evils, right? Or necessary situations. They don't even have to be evil, right? But we've had a lot of opportunity recently to work with clients who are interested in a more extended learning experience to really make change happen, right? So we have one client where they have an instructor-led, virtual instructor-led now, but instructor-led, right?
Yeah.
1-hour course during which they know they're not making, right? They're inspiring people in this workshop.
Mm-hmm.
But they know they're not making behavior change. So then what we're doing is we're following up with a very structured 12-week behavior change chatbot that moves you through. We've worked with Anthony Worth on the design of this, and he's a big behavior change and learning motivation guy out of the Netherlands. And, we start with a little bit of knowledge, like, hey, remember what you forgot from last week's workshop. Gets then into skills, but then really focuses on coaching and supporting that application.
Okay.
So there's lots of really interesting ways to go about doing that. And that's actually a project that we're using xAPI to analyze the experience of that.
Right.
But not everybody's up for that yet.
Yeah. It's interesting, that initial problem, people coming to you and saying, I want a course about this, I want a course about that, which solutions people call that solutioneering on behalf of the client. Mm-hmm. It's a problem in marketing too. It's been my experience that people come to you say, we want you to write a brochure about blah, 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 such and such. I did realize that the big challenge for me, if I was going to grow as a marketing person, was to be able to learn how to say, well, what do you want to do with this thing? Who are you trying to reach? What you want to try and convince them about? because a brochure might not be the answer. It might be a conference, or it might be a video, or it might be a program of so on. Actually, I think that those type of behaviours are quite well embedded in the marketing skill set. You know, you don't get to be a marketing director without being able to do that, to be able to talk to the business like that. Do you think that is a step that L&D people have to take within their career development, or and perhaps aren't doing so much, or is that unfair on L&D people?
I think it's absolutely fair on L&D people. And so part of our Project Ignition, when we start a project, is we show up, we spend the first hour with a business sponsor saying, what's our goal here? Actually, the business sponsor and the subject matter expert, and ideally some members of the learner population, right?
Yeah.
And so what do we, and I'm doing this actually this afternoon. And it's interesting because I put out the agenda for the kickoff session, and the client came back and said, well, we already told you what our goal is. And I went, yes, right? Well, we're going to, the goal is in a learning program, right? The goal is to achieve some sort of performance, to make something better. And let's figure out what that is. Because if all we do is create a learning program, we may not actually solve the problem if the problem wasn't a learning solution, right? Even the best learning solution in the world, right? If the other factors that go into job performance aren't there, we're not going to hit the mark. So it's a dance though, and especially where you are in the power dynamics of the organization. Sometimes that's hard to say. Yeah.
Last episode we had Craig Weiss on the podcast. We were asking him what he thought about the state of buyer knowledge, and obviously he's an analyst of learning systems, and I feel like asking you a kind of similar questions about the buyers of your services and companies, but not necessarily about your decision maker, but about their decision maker. What do you think the level of knowledge about learning is within organizations beyond the L&D department? I mean, they're completely isolated in knowing anything at all about how learning works, those departments, or is it kind of appreciated in other areas of the organization that it might not be a 1-hour course?
It depends so much on the culture of the organization, John. I am finding that just as, learning people don't have a deep appreciation for all it takes to do finance or manufacturing, right? But we have respect for what it takes to do finance and manufacturing. And we don't presume that we can waltz in and do their jobs. To a certain extent, depending on the organization, sometimes finance and manufacturing feel they can do learning. But I also see a lot of organizations where the L&D team is respected for its unique contribution. And I think that stature within the organization may have raised a bit with the pandemic and multiple things happening, right? A lot of change, and we've got to get the word out to people. How do we do that? The L&D team, right? The L&D team is how is one of the ways in which we can help organizations change rapidly. At the same time, I think that the pandemic also helped decalcify some learning development processes where we realized that we can't always take 16 weeks to build a course. Sometimes we have 16 hours to build a course. And we can actually do it. It's not the same as a 16-week course. It actually can work though. And I think so there's been some learning in both ways. And I think that's an opportunity for us that we shouldn't waste as we move forward.
Yeah. You sort of raised a point there that takes me back to the last kind of head of marketing job I had within a e-learning vendor, which was that very often our client wasn't in L&D. They were head of a functional area like sales or compliance. Do you come across that very often in your work, and do you work differently with those type of people?
About half of our work comes direct from the business, and half the work comes from an L&D team. Right. So we do see that. Or a support or performance group that's related to the business, not to learning and development proper.
Yeah.
And we do approach them differently simply because they each have different needs and different approaches. So, for example, a lot of the messaging, I can talk L&D person to L&D person, and we kind of get it, right? I don't have to convince an L&D person that a 30-minute e-learning course is not as good as a 30-minute e-learning course or a 15-minute e-learning course with a 12-week behavior change program afterwards. I have to prove that to the business, right?
Yeah.
But what I'm also able to do with the L&D team, one of the things we love doing is providing, not only answering your problem today, but we offer professional development. We do a lot of sharing with our clients so that we're helping to raise the skills of the L&D team that we work with, and their visibility and their notoriety in the space too.
So Megan, there's just so much I'd love to ask you about. So I hope it doesn't feel like an afterthought to have left this question to last, but something I've also heard you talk about very passionately is the issue of women in learning. There's a view out there from some that actually L&D is an industry that has quite a lot of women in it and a good number of them in leadership positions. So what's the problem? I hear this. It's not a view I personally hold, I'd hurry to say, but I bring it up because I'm interested to hear what you would say to those people. I mean, they very often wouldn't say it to you directly, but they might say, it might be a man saying it to other men.
Absolutely. And I'll tell you, John, I don't know the industry-wide stats, and I think that they probably vary by the segment within L&D, right? But yes, there are a lot of women in L&D, and a lot of women on the trainer end of L&D, and fewer when you get to the technology end of L&D. Yeah. And so, and not that they're missing altogether, but if you were to look at the leader, women and then leaders of the software companies that support this industry, it's mostly guys. Right? It's mostly white guys. And so it'll vary where you are. I think, like many other functions in large organizations, the higher you go in a hierarchy, there are filters that tend to prevent women from rising to the top as fast as men. And those filters are self-imposed, those filters are peer-imposed, and those filters are organizationally and culturally imposed, right? And those filters compound. Right? So a fast rising man in a position is going to look like a rock star, even if the reason why he is rising fast is that women are being filtered out, right? Or filtered. And so there's actually some really interesting research and analysis of the data. So if you want to get kind of both at the same time, in the New York Times recently on the effects of even small amounts of bias over the length of a career, it's astounding. So yes, right. There's some filtering. There's a lot of women, and there's a lot going on. I think the other thing to look at, right? Oh, and then there's by segment, right? Where are the women? And then let's layer on, right? We can't forget the intersectionality, because we're all not just men or women, we're also Caucasian, right? So I have immense privilege simply because I walk in as a white person. I walk in as a middle-aged, college-educated white woman in the West, right? And so there's racial issues, there is LGBTQ issues, there's disability issue, right? There's so many different ways to layer on our identities that that can stack up in the workplace, right? So no conversation of around any one of those is really meaningful without the conversation around the others. But I think also, but I think also, John, the thing is that in organizations, right? So outside of the L&D providers or L&D people, right? Within organizations, right? We also want to look at the power dynamics in general. So yes, we may have a woman, right? So leader of L&D, a woman who's a leader of DEI, a woman who's a leader of HR, a woman who's a leader of finance or legal counsel. None of those is the power spot in the organization. At the C-suite, those are all still support functions and not the primary reason why the business is in business. And that organizationally, right, you tend to promote all the way to the top from the power centers of the organization, which are often going to be sales and production. Right? So those are the spaces that even if we were to say, hey, you know what, women in L&D, right, we've got perfect parity. I'm not saying we do, right? Within our larger organizations, we are still not at that same high level of power.
And then, of course, you could be a CEO with an all-male board, or you may be funded by a private capital company, and when you go into that boardroom, it is all completely male.
Absolutely.
Yeah. When you said filters a bit earlier on, what sort of things, talking particularly, but I really get your point that intersectionality comes in, and you can't really talk about the issue of women divorced from other types of protected characteristics. I think, struggling with the language here a bit. I have to get this from my teenage daughter. But talking about women in particular, what kind of filters would come into play? Are we talking about cultural factors, or is it things around sort of childbirth and maternity leave, and so on?
All of the above, right? So I think there are three kind of broad buckets of filters, right? One are our own personal filters, right? And there's research that, for example, women tend not to, if you look at a job description, women tend not to apply for a job until they feel like they can hit 80% of that job description. The longer and more detailed the job description is, you tend to get fewer women applying for it.
Right.
Where the same research shows that if men feel they can do about 10 to 20% of the job, they feel qualified to apply for it. So you then, right? So this, admittedly, this is a self-filter. And yes, I can say, right, there's societal impacts on it and all, right? There's an individual choice that a woman does make to apply or not apply. And these are broad generalizations, John, right? But backed up by research that it's not just individuals, it's quantities of individuals, right? So then you get into that, right? That compounding factor. If fewer women are applying for the next position up, who's applying? Well, it's all men. Well, of course, we're going to hire men, and we have a higher likelihood of getting men. The same thing is that, right? So we then get this strange movement there, right? There's also, when I'm working with my peers, right? When women are working with peers, there is it's basically a competency likability bind. People who are seen as likable are seen as less competent. People who are seen as very confident and very assertive about that, right? Women who are seen as competent and assertive about their skills and their needs for their team are often considered unpleasant to people to work with.
Yeah.
Where the behaviors they're doing may be absolutely acceptable in a man, or often written off as, hey, he's really good at what he does, right? He's getting results, right? Look at the numbers, right? And so there's that kind of peer group interpersonal on a regular basis. Then we get into biological and societal kinds of things, right? So yes, right? Childbirth, which right now is predominantly done by people with uteruses. Child rearing, which doesn't have to be, but often is. In some cases, because the male in a family makes more money because of all of the other things we've just talked about, right? Or has a more important career, right? Because of all the other things we just talked about, right? At the other end, right, of one's career is menopause, right? So right at the time that we expect that senior executive women will be doubling down, again, right? There's
Yeah,
another
some kids
life
have grown
change.
up and so on. Yeah.
Absolutely, absolutely. And so there's early research on the impacts of that too. So there's a lot going on.
Lastly, what's the best place for people to follow your thought and activities?
It depends on which set of thoughts in the day.
Okay, you scatter around from platform to platform, do you?
I kind of skitter around. So interestingly, both ATD Press and Learning Solutions Magazine have a mixture of both my work on xAPI and Agile Project Management for Instructional Design. Both of those, so depending on where you tend to research, we're hosting the xAPI cohort and the xAPI party. And so xAPI party will be a free conference on December 10th. And we're going to talk about novices and newbies and people who are brand new to this. And we've got an entire track, another sign of the maturity, an entire track that is just like deep in the weeds stuff. Like not what is CMI, but like really, really deep in the weeds, profiles, CMI, data governance, kind of stuff.
Sounds like a real party.
And then we actually have workshops offer workshops on instructional design at xAPI and Agile Project Management at torrancelearning.com/shop. So lots of ways to find us.
Marvelous. Megan Torrance, thank you very much for appearing on the podcast and taking the time today.
I've had a lovely time, John. Thank you.
That's all on the Learning Hack podcast for this time. Many thanks to Megan and to our sponsors, Learning Pool and Cornerstone. The Learning Hack is completely independent and transparently funded by sponsorship. If you want to help others find us, please like, follow, rate, review and subscribe on your podcast platform of choice or on YouTube.
Next week, we have a brand new episode of Great Minds on Learning. This one's about online educators. And the week after that, it's Summer Salomonson from Cornerstone on the Learning Hack. Till next time.
Stay curious, learning people.
Now I finally get it.
Hit record and people immediately disappear from the screen.
Sorry, I realized my space heater turned on.